Good morning, everybody. Dear guests in this room and online, because we're live streaming this event. My name is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I direct the Center on the United States and Europe here at the Brookings Institution. I have, as you may be hearing, the remnants of a nasty cold. I've also been unfairly told to keep my remarks brief, which for a German is an astonishing thing to ask, but I will try. It is my immense pleasure today to host the distinguished German historian and essayist Karl Schlögel, who will speak here on Ukraine on the mental map of Europe. He and I will engage in a brief conversation afterwards, followed by a wonderful panel featuring Eric Charamella from Carnegie, our own Fiona Hill, and moderated by our good friend Michael Kimmage, the director and I think savior of the Kennan Institute, formerly of the Wilson Center. And before I introduce our speaker, I would like to warmly thank the Goethe-Institut Washington, in particular Klaus Krischock, who's not here with us today, Andrea Zell, Teddy Roger, and Katharina Krüger, for helping make today's event happen. As you know, I reached out to you on the day last July that I heard on Deutschlandfunk, German National Radio, that Karl Schlögel would be the 2025 recipient of the Peace Prize of the German book trade, to ask whether we could bring him here for a talk. To my joy, you immediately said yes, and made Karl Schlögel's trip to the United States this month possible. He spoke in New York on Monday, will speak in Boston next week, and was able to visit Charlottesville and Thomas Jefferson's home in Monticello yesterday. We are very grateful to you for being wonderful partners and for your respect for our independence. And Karl Schlögel, who is traveling here with his wife, the distinguished historian Sonja Margolina, sitting here in the audience as well, is one of Europe's great historians of Russia and Eastern Europe, teaching first in Constanze and then at the Viadrina University in Frankfurt-Oder. He is famous for his emphasis on a spatial approach to history, laid out in his landmark book In Space We Read Time of 2003, urging a reading of history through places, geography, and material culture rather than through abstract concepts alone. His extraordinary 900-page encyclopedia, The Soviet Century of 2017, discusses industrial cities, Soviet perfumes, kitchens, crematoria, fashion, phone directories, and even what he calls the acoustic texture of the Soviet Union. And in this way, he vividly connects the lived experience with larger historical forces and currents. And his book, American Matrix, of 2023, documents his deep affection for the United States, all while exploring interconnections between America and Russia, including the late Soviet fascination with Dale Carnegie. I recommend you read it. As a prolific writer, celebrated stylist, and public intellectual, Schlögel has also been instrumental in filling then the strange blank spaces in our, and I mean in European and German, understanding of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, in the Soviet as well as in the post-Soviet era. And he does this with an authority based not only on profound erudition and scholarly rigor, but on a life of deep immersion through decades of research, travel, and building connections. His works on violence and suffering in the Soviet Union, the Gulag, the deportations, the famines, are essential to understanding modern-day Russian politics. And since the 2014 revolution of dignity on the Kiev Maidan and the illegal annexation of Crimea, and then Russia's full-scale annexation in 2022, he has been an even more prominent voice in German public debates, advocating for Ukrainian sovereignty and greater empathy and support from Europeans and indeed from Germans. Professor Schlögel, in your acceptance speech for the book prize last November, you spoke very movingly of Ukraine as a, and I quote, prism of all European experiences in the century of extremes, the venue of revolutions, civil war, world wars, the Holodomor, the Holocaust, and finally the stage for independence and freedom after decades of struggle. Today, you said, it reminds us, quote, what Europe once stood for and why it is still worth defending. Professor Schlögel, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming here today.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much, the Brookings Institution and the Goethe-Institut, for bringing me to Washington again. I'm very happy to be back in this great city. I'm very happy to be back in the United States of America. And I will try to give some of my deliberations and ideas on this subject. I'm glad because I'm here also to understand a bit better what is going on here in the US. Writing in these days about mental maps is not without risk. You may sit at your desk at home or in the library, but you feel like in the situation room of a news agency or the editorial board of a newspaper. Under your eyes, the global political landscape is changing with breathtaking speed. With every news, with every report, with the next speech of a president, the situation may have changed. As a historian, one is used to work at a distance, sine ira et studio, without anger or bias, to go into periods of time far away. But at the same time, historians are contemporaries, not only searching and navigating through archival materials, but people who are open to the world they live in, paying attention to what is going on now. They are eyewitnesses of the present, of the history in the making. When I started to prepare for this talk about Ukraine on the mental map of Europe, breaking news came in, fresh, live reports from Istanbul, Tel Aviv, Amman, Abu Dhabi, Tehran. The strikes by Israel and the United States on Iran had begun. It was not entirely unexpected, but nevertheless, the focus of attention moved to the sites of a new war, with bombs falling on Iranian cities, counterstrikes on American military bases, missiles breaking through the Iron Dome over Israel. A new theater of war, a new focus challenging and distracting our attention. This is not only shocking, but also challenging, a great opportunity to rethink and to navigate the vast open seas ahead, to get on board of Alexander von Humboldt's ship, to leave behind the world we know, and to risk a view into a world unknown to us. This is a preliminary remark in order to emphasize that we are in a situation where it is clear that history is open, that all the narratives we have become accustomed to are now under review, a situation where we can learn a lot from historical experiences of past generations, although we learn that lessons from history might be instructive, but do not serve as recipes for solving the problems we are confronted with now. The world order which evolved after World War II and during the Cold War has disappeared. The time of bipolarity, the hegemony of two superpowers has come to an end, and new players are now on the stage. This is a time of disorder in which we must attempt to manage turmoil and the collapse of the old order and to find ways out for, hopefully, a new stability, reflecting the real balance of power. I would like to situate my talk about Ukraine on the mental map of Europe within this framework of moving coordinates. In my lecture, I want to focus on 4 points. First, Russia's aggression since 2014 and its full-scale war since 2024 has radically changed the mental map of Europeans. Second, we are challenged to explain to ourselves and to the Ukrainians why Europe did not take notice for a long, long time of the second largest state in Europe. The mystery of the great Ukraine as terra incognita, the absence of Ukraine in the general European consciousness. Third, the German case is a specific one, and I want to make clear why even in Germany, geographically so close to Ukraine, it lasted so long to include the Ukrainian question in the German and European horizon. And fourth, mental maps are about geography, but not only. After a long phase of neglecting geography, there is now an overestimation of it in the current turn to geopolitics, the so-called spatial turn, as the sole key for understanding of what is going on, with the danger of a new reductionism. And this is not only of epistemological interest. Fifth and finally, the fate of Ukraine will define the fate of Europe and probably of the West, whatever we understand under this term. First, from the periphery to the center. There is, as we saw nearly a month ago on the 4th anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion on February 24th, 4 years ago, a mood of fatigue. Despite the horrors of Russian warfare, using the cold as a weapon against the population of Ukraine's big cities, demolishing the infrastructure in order to make the cities unlivable, there were no great demonstrations in the European capitals comparable to what we have seen after February 24th in 2022. In the news, we saw the representatives of the European Union arriving at Kiev's central station for another state visit in Kiev. Yes, this was a demonstration of solidarity, but on that same day, the delegation from Brussels had to tell the Ukrainian leadership and the people of Ukraine that the European Union's 90 billion euro loan was blocked by two member states, in this case, Hungary, Slovakia. So they arrived with empty hands in an extremely dramatic emergency. The city under siege, thousands of drones and missiles coming down, a city without electricity, without heating, elevators out of order, elderly people helpless and caught in their apartments. The great and rich European Union was unable, at least for a moment, or unwilling to help in the most dramatic situation. I do not like Brussels bashing. I'm just pointing out the obvious gap between the EU's declaration of support and the hard reality. What I'm saying seems to be in open contradiction to what I was saying in my introductory remarks, that Ukraine has taken center stage in the consciousness of Europeans. This is reflected in the everyday coverage of the events taking place in Ukraine. Before 2014, most Europeans didn't even know that there is a country, state, nation named Ukraine. Most Europeans, educated people included, did not have an idea where all these cities under Russian attack were located: Kharkiv, Mariupol, Odessa, Lviv. There were some connoisseurs, cinephiles, who remembered the Odessa steps, the scene in Sergei Eisenstein's classic battleship Potemkin film. There were historians of the Habsburg lands who knew about Lemberg, the Little Vienna, or Czernowitz, the pre-World War II hub of Jewish German language literature, now known as Chernivtsi. Only very few had an idea of Kharkiv as the city of constructivist skyscrapers in the 1920s. Until the violent clashes at the so-called periphery, Ukraine seemed far away, barely existing. The overlooked land, to quote the title of my fellow historian Martin Schulze-Wessel's most recent book. A breakthrough in the perception of Ukraine, at least in intellectual and academic circles, was, of course, Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands book, followed by a wave of scholarly books for a rather broad audience. The mass movement of the Maidan in 2013-14, the confrontation and the bloodbath in the center of Kiev, the everyday news. These events reorganized the spatial perception of ordinary Europeans. Many correspondents, originally based in Moscow, the former center of the Soviet Union, moved to Kiev. In news coverage, documentaries, and talk shows, experts were now discussing questions of Ukrainian history, language, and Oh, interesting. I'm sorry.
Which page?
It happened what I never expected that it will happen.
Welche Seite?
5. Number 5.
Also ich habe den letzten Ausdruck.
Ja. Yes. First, now coming back to this defining the picture and the image of Ukraine in the last years. People first time in their lives heard about Holodomor, the Red Famine of the early 1930s, and that Ukraine and Belarus was the main battlefield in World War II, or that Chernobyl, the site of the nuclear disaster in 1986, is a city north of and close to the capital of Ukraine. There was a massive flow of information over the years, not only of political news or reports from the battlefield, but about Land und Leute, people in country, everyday life, for the first time in the life of generations. I call it the new presence. That has many more and important effects. The presence of Ukrainian refugees in European countries, hundreds of thousands, in Poland and Germany, in each country more than 1 million each. Mostly women with children, elderly people. They live in small and little towns and villages. There are networks of volunteers and twin cities. There is a network of communication, buses and cars moving back and forth across the borders, with children in kindergarten, bi or trilingual after years. I would call it the emergence of a common space of shared experiences, basic information and neighborhood, beyond any multicultural romanticism or kitsch, and of course implicating conflicts in everyday life on the ground. We should also take into account the rise of the young Ukrainian literature, the prominence of public intellectuals and writers like Yuri Andrukhovich and Zeri Shadan. The Russian war has transformed the atmosphere, the public space, the political debate. The parliament, the parties, the public intellectuals are debating the Ukrainian issue, the relationship to Russia, the issues of defense and security, largely taboo before. The discourse about the ambiguity or even disastrous implications of so-called Neue Ostpolitik, the difference between illusion, self-deception, and realpolitik. I would characterize it as a politicization and emerging awareness of the reality of the state of the art in early 21st century. The understanding of the new reality and the new attitude was expressed in Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz's word, die Zeitenwende, the break, the caesura, the rupture we are confronted now. Finally, the Russian war against Ukraine is understood as a war not only against Ukraine, but against Europe or against the West in general. This is not just an abstract theory or metaphor. War, violence, subversion are penetrating European societies in many forms: espionage, sabotage, networks of disinformation and political influence, assassination attempts, corruption and pro-Russian lobbyism, playing on inter-party friction and instrumentalizing social and political tensions within domestic audiences, as well as intervention in the process of decision-making and elections. The debate on self-defense and security has had an especially profound impact in Germany, a country so deeply pacified and demilitarized after 1945. But there is no guarantee that this transformation will continue and will be stable. The challenges of finding the financial means for supporting Ukraine and for funding military defense are severe, and they begin not with the question of money, but with awareness, or a lack of awareness, a realistic attitude in confronting Russian imperialism and the incertitudes of the US policy. It is quite open in which direction Germans, the population, the electorate will go. As polls show, the overwhelming majority sympathizes with the struggle of the Ukrainians, but at the same time, there are substantial minorities on the left and on the right, which look at the so-called negotiations with Russia as the only way to end the war, reiterating again and again the mantra that Russia is invincible and that it is Ukraine which must be pushed to accept even the hardest compromises. Germany first, That is the slogan which the populists mobilize against the support of Ukraine. The spirit of appeasement is not far away in times of Ukrainian fatigue and war of attrition, despite an increasing consciousness of the Russian danger. That's why we have to look back on the reasons for the long absence and ignorance of the Ukrainian issue, especially in the German mind. This is my second point. The change in public perception after 22 is quite radical, I think, and it is not easy to explain Ukrainians' lasting absence up to the last moment. To Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, they were still ongoing up to the moment of the full-scale invasion. And until then, the position of the German government was that the pipelines had nothing to do with politics, because, as chancellors Gerhard Schröder, Angela Merkel, and Olaf Scholz all argued, they were a private commercial project. Since the invasion, the self-inflicted delusion of the official German position has been investigated in numerous analyses, books, and research about the so-called Russian connection, together with the willful illusions and blind spots of Germany's relationships with Russia, Eastern Europe, and above all, Ukraine. What are the most significant moments of this blindness? The German perspective was in all of this time shaped by the dominance of the German-Russian relationship. Ukraine was perceived for years, decades, centuries, not as an entity in itself, ein Wesen an und für sich in Hegel's words, but in the shadow of and independence from the Russian Empire, even as an integral part of it. Ukrainian history as part of the history of the Russian Empire, Ukraine in a Russian-dominated, Russocentric perception. I would like to illustrate this with my own experience, although I do not pretend to represent the German view to Ukraine. Growing up in West Germany, given the rare opportunity to learn Russian in a Benedictine boarding school with relations to the Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of Constantinople, with a DP from Eastern Poland as teacher, with no family connections to the world on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I went to Ukraine for the first time during my school years in 1966. I have seen Uzhhorod, Lviv, Kiev, Kharkiv on my way to Moscow. Ukraine as a landscape of transit. You could speak Russian everywhere. Later, doing Russian and East European studies and archival research, I went to the archives and institutes in Moscow and Leningrad, like most of my colleagues. Only a few traveled to the so-called provinces, to the backyard, to the hinterland. German academia was deeply Russocentric, Moscow-centered, and unfamiliar with Russia's periphery, whether it was Georgia, Uzbekistan, or Ukraine. Of course, there are a few exceptions, like my colleague Andreas Kappeler. The American historian Mark von Hagen published in 1995 his seminal piece, Does Ukraine Have a History?, in which he argued that historians had failed to give Ukraine historiographical legitimacy. This was also my, not only rhetorical question. Many years later, after an awakening which took place very late during the Maidan protests and during my travels in spring 2014 in the Donbass to cities like Kramatorsk, Donetsk, and Mariupol. I had to realize in those weeks that I would have to go to school again and to learn, mostly through books on Ukraine written in the Ukrainian diaspora, such as the Canadian Ukrainian historian Orest Subtelny. But this is not only my personal case. It was characteristic for a whole generation of scholars, and not only scholars. From Peter the Great up to Bismarck's Reich and World War I, the imperial perspective remained dominant, with consequences up to the present day. My historian colleague Gerd Kühnen dedicated a whole book to the analysis of the German-Russia complex, the Russland complex. Even today, you can still hear Russia described as our most important neighbor, strangely enough, given that our actual neighbor in the East is Poland. Even enlightened and educated politicians like the late Chancellor Helmut Schmidt questioned the existence of the Ukrainian nation. He used the strange term, die russischen Stämme, the Russian tribes, to describe Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. Until today, many Germans see the Ukrainian language as a Russian dialect, a minor one, of course, not to mention the absolute dominance of Russian literature, the prestige of the Russian culture, and the ignorance of Ukrainian writers like Taras Shevchenko and others. That said, there was an increasing interest in things Ukrainian before World War I, when the founder of German East European Studies, Otto Hötsch, he was the chair where George F. Kennan did his studies in the late 20s in Berlin, met Mikhailo Hrushevsky and read his book Russia and the Ukrainian Question. There were influential public intellectuals and journalists who were interested in Ukraine as a possible factor to destabilize the Russian Empire. This moment created an opportunity for Ukraine to achieve national independence and sovereignty. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty in February 1918, which led to the establishment of a short-lived hetmanate under the ex-Tsarist General Pavlo Skoropadsky, who was forced after the collapse of the Ukrainian People's Republic to go into German exile, where he died in 1945. There was a renewal of the German-Russian Entente under new conditions in Rapallo 22, with a clear revisionist ambition against the powers of the Versailles Treaty, stabilizing Soviet Russia and aimed against the Second Polish Republic and an independent Ukraine. In interwar Germany, there was always a segment of public opinion supporting the Ukrainian struggle for independence, including the Ukrainian Scientific Institute, founded first in Prague, later on in Berlin, with leading scholars and intellectuals. On the Ukrainian side, there was always the hope that Germany would support Ukrainian independence. The clash of the Nazi and Stalin empires after June 22 in 1941 was perceived as a second chance to win independence and statehood, as Poland was able to do at the end of World War I. This was the basis for cooperation and collaboration on the Ukrainian side, names like Stepan Bandera, and it was also the goal of some groups within the Nazi regime, like Alfred Rosenberg or Wilhelm Canaris from intelligence, to exploit the Ukrainians to bring down the Jewish Bolshevik Soviet Union. Both ambitions failed against the horrible background of the German Generalplan Ost, which unleashed terror, massacres, forced labor, and genocide. Ukraine and Belarus became the main laboratory of Nazi Germany's genocidal practices. After 1945, a liberated and reoccupied Ukraine became, despite being a member of the United Nations, an integral part of the Soviet Union and disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. You can feel the consequences of the Second World War in German-Ukrainian relations up to our days. For most of the war generation, including my father, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was called the Russlandfeldzug, the invasion of Russia. Also, the main theater of war was Belarus in Ukraine. After World War II, Germans felt guilt and responsibility for the crimes on Soviet territory, addressing only Russia, but not the other peoples and territories of the former Soviet Union. But the greatest share of forced labor workers, almost 3 million, were deported from Ukrainian lands. The main sites of the Shoah by bullets were on Ukrainian soil. The entire territory of Ukraine suffered from German occupation. Today, Germans learn in the evening news of places where Russian soldiers are fighting against Ukraine and where their fathers may have fought as well. The satellite photos of today show the same sites that the German Luftwaffe saw more than 80 years ago: Lemberg, Lviv, Donetsk, Stalino, Kramatorsk, Sumy, Kharkiv, and others. German companies owned the metallurgical factories of Mariupol and the tractor factory of Kharkiv, which have now been destroyed by the Russians. Sometimes, even the monuments commemorating the sites of German massacres became targets of Russian ballistic missiles and drones, like Babin Yar in Kiev and Drobitskaya in Kharkiv. Germany has to learn that the Third Reich's war crimes on Ukrainian soil implicate a specific moral obligation and responsibility for today. We cannot come to terms with the past without acknowledging the role of Germans on Ukrainian territory, whether in Babyn Yar, the blowing up of the Dnipro power station, the extinction of all Jewish life in Ukraine, the deportation of Ukrainian forced labor, and the starvation to death of Soviet soldiers in the POW camp in Darnitsia on the left bank of the Dnipro. We cannot speak about the present-day horrors while ignoring the horrors of the past and vice versa, be that of German or Russian origin. The mined and torched soil of the Donbass today, ecocide and herbicide, the verbrannte Erde policy, torch earth the Germans left behind. The explosion of the Kachovka Dam and the blowing up of Dnipro, the winter 25 and 26 with thousands of apartment blocks without heating and electricity, and the winter of the German blockade of Leningrad. Coming to terms with the past is not an anniversary ritual, but helps us to understand that everything can happen again. There is still a large field for research and exploration here, which has been neglected for many years. Talking about the German perspective requires an additional remark. We have not only one, but at least two perspectives. Of course, there are, in fact, many more, since we have a West German and an East German viewpoint and narrative. I was speaking about my personal experience that I, for a long time, perceived Ukraine as a kind of province in a Russocentric empire. But there was also a GDR version of this perception, Ukraine as an integral part of the Soviet world. There were city partnerships between Leipzig and Kiev, for instance, thousands of students and engineers working for years in Ukrainian universities or along the construction site of the Druzhba pipeline. There was a quite popular tourism with attractive destinations, riverboats, and Arctic youth camps on Crimea, the legendary pearl of the empire. The citizens of the GDR were often closer to Ukraine than their Western tourist fellows, because they belonged to the same Sovietized sphere of life, the Soviet bloc. Look at the memoirs of Angela Merkel, traveling wild and hitchhiking in her youth through the vast spaces of the Soviet Union. Very often, the tourists from the GDR did not understand, and the Russophile inclinations and demonstrations in the eastern states of Germany today make clear that they did not understand that Ukraine is fighting to be a free and sovereign country, not for reunification with Russia. Indeed, it is strange that today, 30 years after reunification, there is not more sympathy and support for Ukraine in the former East Germany. I hope that historians and sociologists will someday explain this mystery. My guess, East Germans view Putin as the strong man, the avenger of reunification, as a form of Western colonialism. Finally, we should not forget two more elements at the root of the German-Russian complex: the economic benefits from cheap energy for many, many years, not taking into account the growing dependency of the German industry from Russian gas and oil, and the feeling of gratitude of many Germans for Gorbachev's assistance in managing German reunification, and forgetting the merits of the Polish movement of Solidarność. Finally, there were also elements of corruption networks behind the scene. I have an excursus or a point which maybe is only of epistemological importance, but in fact it has to do with politics. The recent rise of geopolitics is a remarkable phenomenon, since the spatial dimension is inherent in any historical, sociological, or cultural analysis. Space matters as time, the chronological order of the narration, the sequence of events, the process of evolution. Borders are the true indicators of the reach or range of a given system of power, the impact of a given rule or civilization. There are many examples. The treaties of the Westphalian World, the Vienna Congress 1815, the Treaty of Versailles, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, the Iron Curtain, but also the frontier discourse of the American West with Frederick Jackson Turner, or the discourse of the great game in Eurasia, like Halford Mackinder. The rise of geopolitical discourse after the Cold War signifies the end of an order, is an indicator of the collapse first of the Soviet Empire and possibly the temporary end of the world of the second globalization. However, I want to stress one thing. Geopolitics is an indicator, not the key for understanding what is going on. This is banal, but nevertheless important, since in our analysis we must go beyond two theoretical extremes, a determinist geographical one and a constructivist one where geographical conditions are neglected. Both are reductionist. The world we live in is not determined by geography, but at the same time, we cannot ignore the conditions of the physical space. The consequences for analysis are quite simple. We have to find ways of analysis coping with the complexity of the subject, putting to use the entire set of disciplines and approaches, sociology, history, political analysis, economy, etc. A good example for me is the analytical work done by German scholars in exile in the 1930s concerning National Socialism and Fascism. We need this kind of a holistic approach if we want to understand the historically new phenomenon of Putinism and maybe of Trumpism too. In sum, my plea is very simple: to avoid the geopolitical trap, which is a dead end, and be open for a complex civilizational analysis. I call it Zivilisationsanalyse. What this means for our perception of Ukraine is as follows. This is clearly a territorial conflict, but at the same time a conflict, if not a clash of civilizations, also not quite as Samuel Huntington meant it. At stakes is the conflict between the Russian world, the so-called, and what for a long time has been called the West, the Western Hemisphere, the liberal order. For Putin's Russia, this was evident and clear from the very beginning of the war in Ukraine. His aim is not to annex some square miles in Donbass, but to bring down Europe and the West. In that sense, Ukraine is the central front line between the aggressor and his allies and the Europe defending itself, with Ukraine as the main force of resistance in this moment. I will skip one piece about a discussion initiated by Milan Kundera in the early 80s, where he anticipated the rebirth of Central Europe, and that this has an importance for today, because what he said about the rebirth of Central Europe, it is valid for today, the rebirth of Europe in the East, that means in Ukraine. He was anticipating the rebirth, the renaissance, and the comeback of this region in the agony of the late Soviet Empire in the 70s and in the 80s. And there's a new actuality of Milan Kundera's book today. Ukraine is a country and society belonging to the West, and this country is under attack. Here lies the importance of Kundera's text for the Ukrainian situation today. The center of Europe has moved eastward, and the threat of kidnapping the West takes place half a century after Kundera's diagnosis in Ukraine. Ukraine does not want to belong to Russia and not to the Eurasian world. The assault on Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa, Lviv is an attack on European cities in terms of territory and civilization. Finally, We do not know which way Europe and the United States will go. Will they stand with Ukraine or give up? Will they follow the temptations of a great deal with the aggressor, a Munich II in the 21st century? We do not know how European elites and the societies of the European Union will cope with the financial burden of intensified military support in coming years. We do not know whether the European audience and electorate will be resilient to the politics of escalation, to Putin's choreography of fear and blackmailing, whether it can counterstrike the Russian narratives and Putin's total war, and we do not know how American society will handle a situation of multiple crises all over the world: Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, Taiwan. There is no guarantee of solidarity and no guarantee of solid guarantees for the Ukrainian nation under threat. The best and most effective guarantee in this moment are the Ukrainians themselves, the armed forces as well as the civilians. The rest of Europe has to learn from Ukraine late and hopefully not too late. I thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for having lost page 5.
Well, all right. The reason I have this bag with me is that I thought it would be helpful if I show you, this is the Schlögel part of my bookshelf at home. Sadly, not all of these have been translated, but to those of you that read German, this is the Soviet Century, a 900-page book that I referenced earlier, explaining the Soviet Union through its material culture. It's an extraordinary book, and no, I have not read all of it, but it is extraordinary in its breadth and scope and empathy, and I recommend it warmly. This is the American Matrix, which does the same thing for America, and which ranges through the Mall of America, motels, public monuments. And the reason why and then this is a series of essays on Ukraine. That is actually an English translation. We ought to have that in our bookstore, do we? Well, we'll make sure it comes there. That's the German version. That is your book of essays about Europe, and that is the book of conversations with Irina Shabakova. And again, that's just the sort of for public, general public consumption. There is an enormous body of sort of more in-depth academic work on the Soviet terror and so on. I recommend this warmly. The reason I'm doing this show and tell is to explain that there always were historians of Eastern and Central Europe and of the complexities of the Eurasian continent in the European world. And it was people like me who didn't pay enough attention to them. So there you go. Go read this. Thank you. Schlögel, thank you for a fantastic speech. We have a phenomenal panel in the second hour to discuss, I think, the current day implications of what you described in your extraordinarily wide-ranging and compelling remarks. But I would like to go back to the personal, if I may. You said that you grew up in a village in Bavaria, in a farmer family, and you mentioned briefly your father, who had actually been in Russia as a soldier, as was my uncle, as were many of that generation. You also, what I think you didn't say in your talk, but you mentioned in your books, is that you yourself, born in 48, were a Maoist in your student years in the late 60s. Can you tell us about your conversations with your father about the Wehrmacht in Russia?
Yeah. Yes, he was in war from the very beginning, 1st of September up to March 45, and he came back not wounded. He survived, and I discovered very late after his death it's a book, the Wehrpass, the passport for all soldiers.
Yeah.
And I discovered that all the stops he moved were in this book. And I discovered that most of these places I knew, starting with the Polish situation, then the so-called Russlandfeldzug with Lemberg, Kiev, Kharkiv, and he went on through Kramatorsk, which you know now from TV news every day, to Stalingrad, where he got sick and was sent back to a hospital to Germany. The problem is that we had a very severe clash in our family because in the student movement I was quite active and becoming Marxist, etc., etc. And my father told me, "You are trying to collectivize the property of your brother, who is
the farmer,
the follower of on this farm." And from that point, from 68 point, we broke our conversation, I have to say. And I think it was not primarily his guilt, but it was my guilt that I was not interested to get to know and to ask him, and what have you seen? What experience you had? And I'm sure he has seen all these things on the way up to the Volga River. And I have even, when I read the memoirs of Franz Josef Strauss, a very prominent German Bavarian politician, Strauss moved in the first days of the war against the Soviet Union through Lviv, and he described in detail the horror scenes in the streets of Lviv, the pogrom and the mass murder in the streets of Lviv. And I'm sure that my father, was always in these troops moving eastward. He has seen, I'm quite sure. But I knew that, but we had broken our, communication to a certain point, and this is one of the great regrets and deficiencies, I would say, not only in a personal communication with my parents, which were very, I have to say, in many ways liberal. They allowed me to go to Russia and to do all these things. But it was mainly, I would say, the arrogance of people who believed that they know everything and all better than their parents. We know everything about fascism, we knew everything about etc., etc. And so I would say it's fault in my personal.
Yeah, I understand completely what you're saying. My mother told a story of my grandfather, who was an electrical engineer who built turbines and large electrical plants, and who was too old to be drafted by the Wehrmacht, but who was sent, this was the family story, sent eastwards, and I have no idea whether this was all the way to Russia or to Ukraine or to Belarus, to work on some electrical plants, and in the early 1940s, and then returned and locked himself in his room for 3 days and would never talk about what he had seen. And I have to say that I did not have the strength to ask my grandfather about this story, since I'd only heard it from my mother, and she'd already said he would never discuss this. There are these silences in most German families. Bizarrely, my uncle, who was a Russian POW, would never say anything bad about the Russians. Came back with sort of fond memories. So you have both these things in families, but I think we are all, as most Germans are familiar with these blank spaces in our mental maps and have been filling them in, frankly, with the beginning of the wars of Yugoslavia, right? I think that for most of us goes back 30 years and started really in 1991. And in some ways, we've been going backwards, right? In retrospect, understanding just how violent and how dangerous the situation was in 1990, 91, in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when, for example, Russian soldiers killed 200 Latvians, I think, in Lithuania. I'm sorry, in Vilnius, when the Baltic states became independent. I am curious, though, about this trajectory of Ukraine between 2010 and today. The first time I went to Ukraine in my life was, I think, 2008. And it seems to me that there has been a distinct political sea change within Ukraine and within Ukrainian self-perception as not just a nation that is distinct from Russia, but also as a European nation. Do you attribute that solely to external aggression, or is it something that we overlooked 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah. I had the impression that the process of de-Sovietization in Ukraine took longer than in Russia, at least in the center, in Moscow, Leningrad, etc. You could observe forms, phenomena of after-death life of the Soviet Union in Ukraine, very long, in the 90s, etc., despite the fact that mass demonstrations, strikes of the Donbas coal mining workers were very, very important. But they protested against bureaucracy, and it was not. It was a very late process of a nation building, a latecomer in nation building, I would say. But going to Ukraine, you had always the feeling, or I had always the feeling, that Ukraine is very, very different. I mean, most time I spent in Russia and in the Russian part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine is different. You feel that it is, in comparison to the huge empire, relatively small. You can take a train from the western border to the eastern in one night. You have many metropolises. You have Odessa, Lviv, Kharkiv. It's a polycentric. It's not monocentric. Everything concentrated on one capital city. So it's a different way, and you feel everywhere that there are deep connections to the world outside. I mean, that is expressed in people who speak languages. I mean, everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people are. First of all, they are bilingual, Ukrainian, Russian, and they speak English or German English now. Most people in the young generation have been outside. They know. And these are millions who have been working on doing their jobs in Portugal, Spain, Italy, Germany, Poland. So it's a different way of life. And I do not even use or need to say they are fighting for freedom. They are fighting for freedom. They are fighting for their way of life. They want to live their own way of life, to be the owner, or they want to go their way. And they do not accept that somebody from outside is dictating them how they should speak, how they should read, etc., etc. So in my view, it's a very simple and very elementary process, defending their own way of life, and not in nationalistic terms. I mean, being there regularly, I was also always amazed how open this society was. Example, looking TV. Yeah, it was quite simple that all these talk shows, the reportage from soccer game, etc., was in 2 languages. The first half in Russian, the second half in Ukrainian, without problems. There was no problem of ethnic or linguistic clashes. This has been produced in a certain way from outside, or used. Some differences have been used to create clashes and conflicts. And it's not only the West. I mean, being in Odessa, this was a hub for people moving every day by ship to Istanbul. Istanbul was the hub for millions of people from Poland, from Ukraine going. And one of the biggest markets in the east was 7-kilometer famous market bazaar in Odessa. So, how to say, you can call it a non-political perception of what is going on. And my basis for understanding, or for trying to understand what's going on, is looking on the everyday procedures of life, the rituals of everyday life. And this is so different from what's in Russia.
So what you're saying is that rather than the sort of cliche of Ukrainian nationalism that has been so prevalent in European and especially in German discourse, what you're saying is that Ukraine has been a multicultural and, dare I say, globalized nation for over a century in ways that have naturally rooted it in Europe. Right, and that have made it citizens, and that have formed a civil society that has not just roots in Europe, but in fact has local centers in ways that we don't see, for example, in Russia. I could talk to you for hours. Unfortunately, I'm not supposed to, but I do want to say that I am particularly grateful for your insistence, and you use this wonderful metaphor of Alexander von Humboldt's ship sailing into the open seas, saying that history is not determined, that determinist interpretations are dangerously reductionist, and that we need to accept the fundamental openness of this situation, that the history that lies ahead of us, the history that is now being made, is a terra incognita, but that one that we should not be afraid of, but embrace and see as a challenge that we should meet with optimism in the same way that the Ukrainians are doing. And for that, I'm really grateful. And now I'm going to disappear from this panel and invite Michael and Eric Charamella and Fiona Hill to come and join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sure.
Do we have to do anything to turn these on? Okay.
Well, good morning from my end. I'm Michael Kimmage, as mentioned, the director of the Kennan Institute, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here today in the presence of one of my heroes, and it's an especial pleasure to have a chance to ask a few questions of Professor Schlögel and of our other 2 panelists. I have 2 sets of questions in professorial manner. Let me outline that from the outset. And one set is going to be about the past and the present, which I'll ask somewhat different questions of each of our panelists. And then the final set of questions from me before we turn to questions from the audience will be about the future as it concerns Ukraine and its place on the mental map of Europe, but also I think for the purposes of this panel, Ukraine on the mental map of the United States. We do sit here in Washington after all, and there are questions to ask about this local environment among others. So I'd like to start first with a question to Professor Schlögel about what seems to me a contradiction in European attitude, contemporary European attitude toward Ukraine, and that I think that there are two basic visions in Europe of Ukraine. And the first is romantic, and it figured at parts in your talk. And this is Ukraine as an organic part of Europe, as you know, the city that waved the flag of the European Union, Kiev, in 2014, and this bridge that has been crossed with the Zeitenwende, where Chancellor Scholz and others recognize that this is an integrally European story that's happening, and that Russia's war is a war not just against Ukraine, but a war against Europe. This is sort of vision number one. Vision number two is not romantic at all. It can verge on cynicism, and this is Ukraine as a buffer zone, as a place that protects Europe from the Russian menace. And if you look at the language of, for example, the Finnish president, you'll see both versions figure in his language. Sometimes he says Ukraine is defending us Europeans, meaning Ukraine is not a part of the club, but they're an important defensive perimeter, and sometimes Ukraine is us. And so I wanted to start there with that question of you about this contradiction between Ukraine on the mental map of Europe as buffer zone and Ukraine on the mental map of Europe as Europe. Just to comment on that contradiction. Perhaps you don't agree with that as a contradiction, but I'd like to begin with that as a question.
Yeah. I'm not in a position to make political diplomatic negotiations. I think it's the hardest job politicians have in this moment to navigate this. Ideally, Ukraine has always been described as a zone of interrelationship between East and West, between Eurasia and Europe, etc. But I think it is the conflict which escalated, and the survival of Ukraine depends on will they survive as an independent nation, or will they surrender? And from the Russian side, it's quite clear that the leadership does not accept the independent existence of Ukraine. Ukraine is a part of the Russian world. Ukraine doesn't have an identity independent from Russian. This is the program of Ruski Mir. They do not accept this. And so I think any Ukrainian would be glad if Ukraine had a chance to be an independent, call it buffer zone or not buffer zone, an independent, the guarantee of not be attacked and to organize an independent life and future. But this is not the case. And so I tend to, that the Ukrainians have made a decision that their existence depends on a strong solidarity and support and relationship between Europe and Ukraine. And I don't think that it's I believe that the fate of Europe depends on Europe in that sense that the defense of Ukraine is it is the most advanced frontline of defending the process of emancipation from the former empire. And I see Ukraine as a prolongation of what has been, let's say, Poznan in 56, Prague in 68, the Wende and all the events of 89. Maidan is, of course, it's also in the context of the Arab Spring and Hong Kong and the worldwide emergence of civil societies and urban centers, etc. But in my view, it's what is going on in Kiev is the front line of what has started in 89 in Prague, Berlin, etc. And so it's close and yeah. Yeah, I tend more to not to say that this is a neutral space. We have nothing to do with it. Let's call it a buffer zone.
Yeah, as a kind of political avant-garde, whereas a buffer zone feels like a great reduction of what the true issues are in this current war. I would like to turn to you, Eric, and ask about the mental map of this country. And a few things come to mind, sort of tidbits of the recent and somewhat distant past. And so the Chicken Kiev speech that George Bush Sr. gives in Kiev, of course, in 1991. The Budapest, not the Budapest Memorandum, but the Bucharest Summit of 2008, where, with pressure from the George W. Bush White House, the claim is made that Ukraine will be a part of NATO. And then, of course, 2014 and 2022, I think, as Professor Schlögel was describing with Europe, put Ukraine much more on the map of Washington, D.C. and of the United States. But I want to turn the question to you, and Fiona, I'll ask a slightly different version of this question of you in a moment, and just to comment on where you see Ukraine on the mental map of the United States, not in the future, but sort of up to the present moment.
Thanks, Michael. So, we often talk about Ukraine in the gray zone, and I think that's where it was in the mental map of the United States, too. And it was somewhere in between the expanding, enlarging European political and security project, Transatlantic security project, and Russia. And I think when you look at the policy discussions throughout the 90s, there were fundamental questions never really answered about where does Ukraine fit into the picture as decisions were made to start bringing new members into NATO and so on. And I think largely Ukraine, with the exception of the question of its nuclear inheritance and what to do with the nuclear arsenal that led to the Budapest Memorandum, largely Ukraine wasn't on the mental map of policymakers. Of course, we had the Orange Revolution in 2004, and Ukraine became one of the sort of poster children for the democracy agenda, as well as Georgia and so on. But it quickly got subsumed by, a dragged-out war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and so on. And again, with the Bucharest summit, there was still a major question left unanswered about where Ukraine would figure into our own security and political architecture that we'd built and had begun expanding throughout the European continent. I would say, I was in government and I was working at the CIA actually at the time that the Maidan protests broke out. And it was interesting just to see the division of labor at that time between the Russia analysts, of which there were many, 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 dozens, hundreds perhaps, covering all manner of Russian mischief in the Russian economy and so on. And it was a prestigious position to work as a Russia analyst. It was a career. And then the Ukraine team, which was a ragtag small group of people in a very dark corner of the organization who cared a lot about the country and studied its politics in great detail, its politics, its dysfunction, its eccentricities, and its strategic value. But when you compare them on the scale of what the Russia analysts were able to produce and assess, it was very small, paled in comparison. So then you had the Maidan protests, and it started to awaken, I think, a sense throughout our expert class that had focused on the region that, okay, actually maybe Ukrainians have something to say about, not only their country, but the direction of this entire region, and people started paying attention. And then, of course, you have the rapid succession of events with the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in Donbass. And suddenly Ukraine began to move, certainly not to the center of our mental map, but it was beginning to make some waves and have people pay a little bit more attention. I still think, though, that 2014, while it was the beginning of some changes in broader, American policy and thinking, it really wasn't until 2022 that Ukraine became front and center in the mental map of American foreign policy. And it was still sort of a problem set that could be managed, a crisis that could be dealt with. And there was a a desire just to keep things tamped down because we had other priorities. And it was only once, Vladimir Putin made his fateful and criminal decision to launch a full-scale invasion that finally it couldn't be ignored.
Fiona, I want to take a similar version of this question to you about Ukraine on the mental map of the United States, but a bit in the manner of the way Professor Schlögel took us through East Germany and West Germany, two different mental maps. I wanted to raise the subject of political difference or political polarization. You have the speech that President Biden gives in Warsaw at the end of 2022, following very much on what Eric just said a moment ago about how Ukraine has arrived at that point on the mental map of the United States, where clearly President Biden is saying that this is a fundamental conflict. He's going to invest the prestige in the capital of his presidency in the defense of Ukraine and work as closely with European partners as possible to achieve that end. And then sort of on the other end of the spectrum, you have Vice President Vance, before he's vice president, saying Ukraine doesn't matter to the United States. So those are two completely incompatible visions of Ukraine on the mental map of the United States. And I'd just like to ask you either to comment on that point or to take the picture in a bigger way and see where you sort of configure the subject in terms of the U.S.
Yeah, there are so many different things to think about here. And first of all, I'm just so delighted that Karl Schlögel is here. I mean, he's one of the great historians and experts of this region from Germany. And I'm delighted that Constanze and the Goethe-Institut and others both thought of this and made this possible, because I think it's really important for us to look at things from very different perspectives. And I think even for the United States, whether we like to admit it or not, we've been always looking at this from an imperial perspective. Now, I have a kind of a weird personal experience of growing up in one empire and then coming to another. I grew up in northern England, and at the point where the British Empire is well and truly falling apart. And the region I grew up in was the buffer. It was the buffer state before the United Kingdom became the United Kingdom between England and Scotland. And everybody came and invaded. We had the Romans, we had the Vikings, we had, you name it, everybody came. We were the colony. And in fact, what you look at the UK today, and, we may have independence movements, by the way, yet again, in Wales and, Northern Ireland and Scotland, where the national parties have taken over in each of these places, where nationalists have become place-based, just like Ukraine, not necessarily language-based. There's something which is also very important to bear in mind. And what will England be? England will be nothing really, because nobody really has a sense of what England is, which is always the problem of the imperial state. And I think that's what we're dealing with here in the United States as well. We've not understood fully that we're an empire. If we go back 250 years, what was the United States? I mean, it was 13 colonies. Maine was part of the Massachusetts colony. We hadn't, got round 250 years ago to the Louisiana Purchase. Florida was damn right not in the United States, and, not for a period, for all of the nation-bearing discussions that go on in places like Florida and elsewhere. Texas was, of course, independent, and might be again, of course, onto the Russians and many others as they, watch what happens here. And we've got the beginnings and stirrings here of an ethno-nationalist, in a sense, particularly centered around Appalachia, for J.D. Vance, kind of also talking about, the white, kind of settlers who came from, in fact, my neck of the woods in northern England and the Scots, Irish and others, and who created what he's saying is a sort of a nation-bearing, people for what was the borderland, the Appalachian borderland between the original colonies and all of the lands, later on of the Louisiana Purchase. Our own history in the United States is so complex and complicated, with waves of immigration, settlement and expansion. But we tend to think of ourselves as a unified unity, and then, ignoring the fact that we then went out and, basically took over Hawaii, which had already been, seized, earlier by the British, with their ever-expansionist idea of what the British Empire should be. And so we've got lots of blank spaces, in our own thinking about the world and about how we have approached things. And I think, for Germany, same thing. Germany was not a unified country until, of course, Otto von Bismarck provoked a war with France. And the the Prussian, or the Franco-Prussian War, isn't it, the right way around, helped to generate the movement that Bismarck had intended to unify Germany behind Prussia, but deciding not to include Austria and all the rest of it, kind of, which was also a borderland or a kind of buffer, seen with other places. So my point in here is that we've always looked at everything from the kind of vantage point of an imperial center, be it in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in Germany or in other places, forgetting that the history of the United States and certainly of Europe is one of changing borders all the time, all kinds of blank spaces, all kinds of frontiers, and often not at even a coherent sense of who the people are. I mean, if we all said here about looking out, this is a very diverse group of people, and I've obviously got a funny accent, I think of myself as American. I've lived here longer than anyone. I've become a naturalized citizen. I chose to be here in America. And all of the people, I mean, you yourself come from sort of borderlands of what's the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Ukraine. And Eric, the last name suggests somewhere in Italy. So we've all kind of come here from somewhere to build, kind of a nation. And that's what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is, again, as I said, reflective of this shifting history of Europe and of other places where borders change because of war or because of, in the case of the United States, a lot of war and acquisition and buying of territory. And President Trump would like to change that again and expand and purchase even more territory, it turns out. And within that space, you create a very specific sense of identity and commonality. And that's what Professor Schlögel has been explaining. In Ukraine, you've got a place-based sense of identity. You have it in India. Despite the partition, at the end of the British Empire, there was a sense of being within India, despite the diversity of India. Germany, there is a kind of a sense of what Germany is, despite all of the internal divisions and the exclusion of some of the German-speaking world. And I think it's a very complex point, and I'm just really grateful that he's here to emphasize that for us.
I'd like to turn now to a few questions about the future. And we'll have quite different questions for Eric and Fiona than I do for Professor Schlögel in this regard, but let's turn the conversation back to our guest of honor. And I have three questions which I'll sort of ask in sequence, but I'll start with the first, which is what kinds of books need to be written in the future? And I want to start with books about Russia. So, there's an academic move to decolonize Russia, and in a way to displace it. I sometimes feel that can translate into an urge not to write about Russia, which doesn't seem like the solution to the problem to me. So the question is, how do you write about Russia now? You mentioned the Russia bias of your education. I think it figures in the education of many of us who studied this region until recently. That was the bias of academia. The preponderance of your time in the Soviet Union was in the Russian parts of the Soviet Union, sort of linguistic questions. In addition to working through that and being conscious of that, what kind of books need to be written about Russia in the future that do justice to this region and to this topic? It's not a question about Ukraine on the mental map, and yet I think it does affect how we see Ukraine on the mental map, because it is in the end also a question not just about Europe but about Russia. So if I could start there, a question is about what kind of books in the future do people need to write about Russia?
Yeah. We have to have a second life to write these books. But I think it's very important first to acknowledge that it's not only a duty but a huge challenge and privilege to enter a new stage of rethinking all what we know about Russian historiography. But this concerns not only Russia, but many other cases. And it is a great, I would say, adventure in the sense of Humboldt to start again, to go out and to reread. I mean, I would say a lot of historians have been socialized through the imperial view of Kluchevsky and others. There is a different way of telling this story. There are historians who were more interested in the history of periphery, and we have to re-evaluate or rediscover this hidden line of historiography, which is very important to reread the classical Russian historiography. And I mean, there would be a very important impulse if the post-imperial and post-colonial studies would focus more on these last huge transcontinental empire. This would be very interesting, and I hope there are young people starting to do their research, going to archives to redefine and recalibrate Russian historiography. The second point I want to say, when I talked about the intellectual work of the 30s, the people sitting in Pacific Palisades working to coming to terms and to find categories, terminology for what was going on in Central Europe, Hitler, etc. I wish that there will be an international discourse on new forms of post-imperial or post-liberal, or what you call it, to analyze and to come to terms, to find a language, a theoretical language for a new situation. And I'm convinced that what I call Putinism, this is just a name in quotation marks, but it does not define what is going on. Mm-hmm. But I feel that all narratives about post-Soviet Russia, this is mafia state, this is orthodox autocracy, this is etc., we have to find a forum or a way of cooperation, bringing together history, sociology, psychology, arts, linguistics. I mean, for me, very important is to understand the rhetoric, the form, the rhetoric, or what Richard Wortman wrote about the rituals of power. Rituals of power, the mise en scène of power today in Russia. And to come to terms with what I call the cultural hegemony of the Putin regime. And it's not only weapons. And it's not only weapons. It's not only the breaking of the nuclear taboo, but it's the rule of brain, the rule of imagination, the fantasy. And the question is not only Putin, but why the Russian society, or what we call Russian society, why do they not react as they should react in case of aggression and starting a war? So I hope there will be an international discourse, transdisciplinary, to develop categories describing and grasping the system. But it concerns not only Russia.
So the things that concern not only Russia, I'll return to after asking a question of Fiona and Eric. It does seem to me, for the students among us, that the Russia topic demands expertise in nationalism and expertise in imperialism simultaneously. It's not an easy thing to acquire, but you can't do one, or you can't do just one, or you can't do just the other when it comes to Russia, because Russia is a kind of nation state, certainly an empire in most of its forms, and it demands a lot in terms of trying to understand it. And it meshes, I think, Fiona, with what you were saying a moment ago about centering and decentering geographies, ethnicities, and political orders. You can do that globally, as you were talking about, and of course, it's very important to do that in the Russia case. Fiona, I want to ask you a policy question. And I think we could spend a long time, one often does these days, discussing the limitations of our political leaders when it comes to Ukraine, and that's a worthy topic. But I want to put that to the side, and I want to ask the question in a very normative way about where Ukraine should be on the map of Europe, putting, again, the limitations of what people can accomplish to the side for another day. Where should Ukraine figure on the mental map of Europe? Should it be a buffer zone? Should it be something more? Should it be something that's really not a buffer zone? where would you where would you build out the map if you had the singular authority to do so?
Well, I thought that Professor Schlögel had a really nice image of a transit space. It wasn't just Ukraine. It's kind of more than a bridge, but kind of a way of people moving in multiple directions. Actually, you weren't just talking about just going to Russia and then stopping and not coming back. And you talked a lot about people moving around in the land that is, today Ukraine, in many different directions, north and south, as well as east and west, and just the way that so many people had been brought together. And I think thinking of those spaces, transit spaces that connect, I think is very important. Finland, that you mentioned Finland, another language is Finnmark. I mean, the whole idea of this also, the marches, the borders, the kind of the spaces, from one people, one polity, one geography, one, kind of set of different perspectives to another. And I think that Ukraine binds a lot of this together. By chance, this morning, I was listening to a podcast, The Rest is Politics, with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, and they were interviewing Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain. And actually, I just commend everybody to listen to this. He was really quite brilliant. And he was asked that very question by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart about Ukraine. I think he actually, from a Spanish perspective, I wasn't expecting him to be quite so, open about this whole idea of Ukraine being part of the European space institutionally, politically, in terms of geography and in terms of culture. Because, of course, Spain has got a lot of attention recently about, pushing back against Trump and the war in Iran, but also of not being willing, to kind of step up, it seems, in the same way that other countries have been in the defense of Ukraine. But he was actually saying something, quite sophisticated that fits into what you're saying about kind of a Europe that is, in a way, more fluid. And in fact, I think he would be more akin in his thinking, and is more akin in his thinking to Professor Schlögel's idea of Alexander von Humboldt's boat, kind of going off into, kind of a new uncharted territory. And I think that by thinking about Ukraine and part of that, it helps us to think about different connections, different networks, different transit spaces, and different ways about thinking about Europe. Because I'm not sure that Europe is just going to be defined by whatever the European pillar of NATO is or about the EU. I think because of everything that's happening, not just in the war in Ukraine, but also now, even more broadly, not just with Gaza and Israel, but now with Iran and kind of what's going to be certainly a rethinking, reshaping about the whole, political and mental maps of the Middle East, that we're in a period of incredible change. And thinking about end of empires is the end of the American empire. Our empire wasn't all, the same as the British Empire in terms of colonies, but, other people would say, well, actually, yes. But it was certainly an economic and, kind of mercantile empire, but one of influence, Pax Americana. We were kind of the guarantor of a system that we're not anymore, and people are going to be reshaping that. And part of that reshaping is happening in Ukraine. And certainly I was impressed by what Sanchez was saying about how his thoughts of Europe are changing as well, even if Spain isn't, quite the same position as others are, or proximity to Ukraine. I think that's what this is. Ukraine is showing to us that there's going to be a different future.
Yeah, I'm sometimes struck by, these are very subjective perceptions, but the relative optimism that one senses in Ukraine, even though it's in the midst of this horrific war, and the rampant pessimism in much of Europe and the United States at the moment, even though most of us are not living under conditions of wartime. And I wonder if that isn't reminiscent of the optimism some Europeans had, even in the midst of World War II, to imagine something different, better, beyond what was the world of war and fascism in the early 1940s, a kind of dialectical approach to Europe and to international affairs. Well, with that in mind, perhaps, Eric, I want to turn to you, because you've written so extensively and in such enriching detail on the policy tools and instruments that could be used to bring Ukraine closer to Europe. I don't think I'm putting words in your mouth by saying that. I think that that's the position that you publicly defend. And so I want to ask you about that. Where should the path be built? How should the path be built? With what tools and instruments? And again, bypassing the subject of domestic politics and limitations and all of that.
Yeah, I think the key test of your question, where should Ukraine be in the mental map of Europe, is going to be fought behind the scenes over the question of EU accession for Ukraine, where I think you have some very bullish political pronouncements by leaders, and then you start to dig behind the scenes and you see some of these very long-standing perceptions of Ukraine having some stickiness. It's a poor country, it's a huge country, it's a corrupt country. How could we ever absorb, that's the word used, absorb Ukraine into the European Union without breaking the European Union? And I wonder if it gets to Fiona's point about having a more flexible conception of what the European Union and project is, to allow for, a situation where, of course, Ukraine is in an extraordinary circumstance. But even if you take a purely cold-blooded realist perspective and say, okay, we have to draw the line somewhere. Well, this issue set is not going to go away, because Ukrainians, 40 million of them, some odd, have made their view known. And they've gone to the streets, they've taken to the streets multiple times and are fighting for their lives against the Russians. And so I think the idea that you could just sort of politely close the doors and come up with some new solution where Ukraine doesn't really enter Europe except on a very broad political level is hard for me to imagine. And so, personally I think, and it's, who am I to say this as an American, but I do think Ukraine and Ukrainians belong squarely in Europe, and they've made it clear that that's what they want and that they're willing to die for it. And I think it's relatively straightforward, and you just have to figure out, the means to make that happen, and probably be willing to reconsider what are longstanding, fairly rigid bureaucratic procedures. I think on the security side, it's a bit more interesting, and you see this now reflected in the Iran war, where the Ukrainians, President Zelensky, have tried to shift the narrative from Ukraine merely as the victim of aggression, the recipient of aid, this pitiful country that's been attacked, to a security provider, in the sense that they've developed really groundbreaking technologies to counter the daily, nightly drone attacks and missile attacks that they experience, and showing that, they're capable of providing this innovation and this know-how and grit to other countries in the world. It's unfortunate, again, to me as an American, to see our leadership brush that aside and say, we don't need anything from Ukraine, we're the greatest military in the world. Oh, by the way, maybe we need $200 billion more to fight this war because we've run out of many of our munition stockpiles, but we don't need anything from Ukraine. There's nothing they could teach us. I think the Europeans have taken a different approach, where in general there's been much more openness to collaboration with with Ukraine. And I think that's where you could see some real transformations over the next 5 to 10 years, where Ukraine becomes, again, not only the front line that's resisting the Russians, but also an integral part of Europe's conception of its own security and the defense industrial base and so on. So I'm actually relatively optimistic on that part, while I recognize that the bigger questions of political and economic integration come up against some pretty deep-seated biases.
It's very interesting how you connect the word conception to a set of security concerns, because that takes us very much back to the books and the presentation of Professor Schlögel, who's very interested, of course, in mental maps, concepts, ideas, and who concluded his lecture this morning, with an appeal not to indulge the extremes of geopolitics, but also not to indulge the extremes of constructions and intellectual history, to find yourself somewhere in the middle. And I think you take us to exactly that point in your comments, Eric. I want to turn back to Professor Schlögel now with a similar question to the one I asked a moment ago about Russia, but to ask it now about Europe. Constanze, I don't know if the book is up here on stage, but another of Professor Schlögel's book is about Berlin, the eastern train station of Europe. And so there you have the spatial metaphors that seem to figure in so much of your scholarship, focused in this case on the city of Berlin as a focal point, connecting link east-west. What kind of books need to be written about Europe? And since we are here to talk about Ukraine today, that do justice to the place of Ukraine. I don't know if there are enough books already written that do justice to the place of Ukraine in Europe, so I want to ask the question about the future.
I think that there should be books about not only the danger of disintegration and falling apart of the European project in this, under the stress of finding the resources for security, etc. I would be interested to read or to write books about the hidden potentials, which are hidden now, but which could, under the stress of crisis and self-reflection, get into the open. And I'm convinced that Europe has resources which are not taken into account very often. And it sounds very strange if I say there are moments where you are convinced that Europe is strong, stronger than the discourse is on Europe. And maybe it's an example for me is very important, the reopening of Notre Dame in Paris last year. And the Olympic Games at the same time in Paris, in a country which is under heavy stress of internal polarization, etc., etc. But that was a situation where France, and there are other places, can show that they are not falling apart, that they demonstrate a kind of self-assertiveness. And we are always talking about the elections will be in 1 or 2 years, and that the nationalists and the camp of disintegration of Europe will come to power. But there are other tendencies, other potentials, and I would be interested in journalism, sociology, coming to terms with what is going on under the surface. And this is my way of I'm traveling in Eastern Europe or in Europe not as a tourist, but working to find out how a country or society is ticking, is in German, how wie ein Land tickt. And I have to say, going from Berlin in a train, one of 4 trains a day from Berlin to Warsaw, this is a moment of inspiration, that you have the feeling that they are somehow sure that they will make it, despite the political conflicts which are in Poland too. But there's a different atmosphere, and I have to say that coming back from Ukraine, I feel always more certain that they will make it than reading and having the German discourse on Ukraine. So we need explorations like Humboldt to explore spaces we do not know or do not know good enough. And this concerns, of course, Russia. I mean, I can't go to Russia in this moment. And this is a very heavy limitation of my intellectual work. It's not only a limitation of traveling, it's a limitation in epistemological terms. You need to be on the ground to get a feeling what is going on, and to hear and to listen what is going on in this kind of black box in many ways. So I hope this way of professional exploring the lands, the landscapes, the mental landscapes, etc., etc.
So there's another historian of Europe who was also preoccupied with trains, and that was Tony Judd, who, you know, as we look forward, it's also good to look backwards in some ways. His book, Post-War, is actually scrupulous in how much of Central and Eastern Europe it brings into the picture, although the title is painful to remember at the present moment because it wouldn't work for Europe in 2026, and yet the method is, in some sense, there. Professor Schlögel, I want to ask my final question before we turn to the audience. appropriately, I think, about Ukraine and a risk and an opportunity. I think that implicit to what Eric and Fiona said for the United States, and I think the same is true for Europe, is that it's war that put Ukraine on the map for 2014 and 2022. That to me seems like a risk. If you associate a country with a war, you're going to have a very limited view of what that country is. It will be photographs of death and destruction. Militaries are a part of life and society, but they're only one part of things. And I still think, speaking for the US, in terms of Ukrainian ideas, culture, literature, cinema, daily life, I think the views here are very, very limited. There's just very little understanding or very little engagement. I think Europe, there's quite a bit more. But I want to ask my final question of you about the books that should be written about in Ukraine that are not books about war or not books about this war. If you would look at the list of English language books published about Ukraine in the last 4 years, I think all of them are about the war, maybe with a few modest exceptions. But how do we write about this topic, bring it further onto the map of Europe and by extension on the map of the United States without equating a country with a war?
I think there are books already now. At least in Germany, there are some translated. And their topic is, of course, the impact of war. But they are describing how a society is managing everyday life. And the relationship, let's say, between the front line and the hinterland, between managing a life under extreme and emergency situation. And these are studies of resilience, of managing the everyday life under very, very severe circumstances. And even thinking about what will be when this war will end. And there are some terrible perspectives too, that contradictions which are hidden now under the cover of the military defense and struggle will break out, that the post-war Ukrainian society will be confronted with heavy conflicts coming to the open. So I think we have, and in my view, the fact that there is a Ukrainian literature which is able to find a language for describing and articulating what is going on in the society. This is, in my view, a miracle, of a kind of birth of a new literature. Not only defending language, but creating a language up to date. And to be up to date, this is, I would say, the best we can say, to be up to date and to be aware what's going on. So
it makes so much sense for what Europe is at its beginning, sort of created by Homer as a literary entity, and to which literature is so important. I think it brings the topic full circle in quite a beautiful way. Well, we've reached the moment where the audience has its chance to ask questions, of course, of any of the three panelists, and we can begin with the gentleman in the back whose hand shot up first.
Good morning. Thank you for the discussion. My name is Benjamin Wyman. I'm a master's student at the School of International Service at American University. My question is that about energy and energy relief in the European Union currently right now. As I'm sure many of us are aware, last week the U.S. issued a 30-day relief waiver on sanctions allowing global buyers to purchase Russian oil and petroleum products. The European Council has since doubled down and extended sanctions in an effort to continue phasing out Russian energy and avoid funding the Russian side of the war further. So my question is, how does this further deepen European energy insecurity, and what implications does it have on further undermining European support for Ukraine as prices continue to rise and the transatlantic divergences deepen? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a little bit far afield from our topic today, so if you want to address it, by all means, if you want to just keep it for consideration.
Maybe I did not get the...
I mean, I could pick this up, and so could Eric, to save Professor Schlögel from having to delve into this topic. It's a topic about how basically Iran and all the destruction of various oil facilities and the rising in oil prices as a result of this is maybe affecting European solidarity towards Ukraine. And I would actually, say that actually what we're probably going to see in Europe is even more of an effort to have a European-wide approach to energy that has a lot more of an emphasis on renewables. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about how feasible that will be for many countries. But again, I'll just commend you to this podcast I just listened to by chance, this morning with Pedro Sanchez of Spain. And Spain has doubled down and tripled down on renewables. I mean, they've got a lot of sun, solar panels, kind of work there, as opposed to perhaps, in parts of Germany and, other bits where it's a bit darker and, you haven't got the national grids in the same way. We saw, the breakdown in the grid in Spain because of their difficulty in, kind of modulating for the permanent sources of power to the renewables. But everyone's fixing this. And I think the debate in Europe now is a bit different from here. Of course, it's about the, problems right now of access to oil and gas, but it's spurring, I think, even more that movement in favour of discussion of other sources. And that already happened with the Russian invasion. I mean, we know now that the Ukrainians blew up Nord Stream 2. I mean, that was obviously pretty difficult from the German perspective. But Germany's starting to talk again, and Constanze has just come back from Germany about the mistake that they may have made of pulling out of their nuclear program. There's big debates in France and the UK. I mean, they may decide other things, but the debate is not to go right back again to Russian oil and gas, even though that might be kind of something that's obviously important from the Hungarian and playing out in the Hungarian elections or in Slovakia or in other countries. Europe is trying to move on, and it may, in fact, lead to more of a rift with the United States because there's also now a kind of question about the countries that started to invest in US LNG and wondering, because of President Trump's leverage and the decision to attack Iran without any consultation, about whether the United States is also a potentially unreliable energy provider. I've heard plenty of that in the last week as well. I don't know, Eric, if you want to add anything.
No, that's pretty good lay down.
Just one word, as far as I understood. I think that Putin is happy about this situation, raising the prices for oil, gas, etc., and is helping financing his war against Ukraine. And it was one of the shocking news I got that President Trump asked Putin, he asked to help him. I mean, he addressed a person who is helping Iran organizing attacks through assistance, intelligence, etc. And this is one moment of where I'm very confused what's going on to understand what's going on. So, but I think that in all European societies, including the German society, this question of energy and prolonging the sanctions or not, this will be a very severe topos subject in the public and parliamentary debates. And there are, of course, quite not so few people and parties who are recommending that Germany should stop sanctions and to re-enter the energy network with Russia, especially on the extreme left and the extreme right. They are not since yesterday, but since long, they are recommending that Germany should re-enter normal business as usual in energy with Russia. And this is a danger and a tool of pressure of the German society and the political decision process.
Well, I propose that we gather two questions, with apologies to those who won't be able to ask questions, perhaps here in the center of the room, and then we can go through our panel and allow people to make their closing statements.
Thank you for the floor. My name is Karolina. I come from Poland, but I currently study in Stockholm at the Swedish Defense University. And my question concerns talking to people, because in my work I observe this growing fatigue when it comes to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the war fatigue. And sometimes it feels like kind of fighting against the windmills when talking to certain individuals. And I wanted to ask for your advice on how to talk to such people, to speak to their not only minds but also their hearts. Should we focus on the military aspects, security aspects, maybe economics, maybe values, or maybe something else? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the arts of persuasion and regarding the war, and maybe Sir right next to.
Hi, my name is Batu Kutelia. I'm senior fellow at the Delphi Global Research. I'm from Georgia. You mentioned ultra-left and ultra-right in Germany. It's kind of a common trend that we see some kind of a horseshoe coalition of ultra-left and ultra-right also coming together against supporting the Ukraine. We've seen Kremlin file leaks, which kind of cultivated this propaganda narrative in Europe, and we could see this emerging here in the US as well. So what is the reason for this?
Okay, so let's start with Eric, if you don't mind. You can take one or both of those questions about persuasion and then political constellations. Then Fiona will turn to you, and we'll give the last word to Professor Schlögel today. So Eric, if you want to take a whack at either of those two questions.
Maybe just thinking about the political horseshoe a bit, I think it's a really, it's an interesting phenomenon, of course, that's been written about extensively. But on the Russia question, what is interesting to me is that whereas there was a very clear ideological bent to Soviet outreach to different factions, communist factions in Europe and around the world, the Russian strategy has been to pick off and select the marginal figures simply because they are marginal, with the hope that betting on enough of them, eventually they'll start to enter more the mainstream or at least break up the center. And that has been a concerted strategy over the past 20, 25 years. And I think you see it starting to pay off. Again, when you look at the networks of some of these, conferences of, thinking about civilizational clashes and whatnot that take place in Russia, where you see the invitation list of various marginal political figures from Western Europe. When you look at the election monitoring missions, so-called, that went to oversee the fake Crimean annexation referendum in 2014, and there's various members of the ultra-left and ultra-right. So I think that, Russia made a very smart, I would say, investment, extremely damaging and dangerous to, the stability and democracy of European countries, but it made a smart bet to try to, recruit these figures that were essentially nobodies 20, 25 years ago, and hope that over time all of these other pressures, the pressures of globalization, migration, again, some of which, in the case of migration in Syria and the Middle East, Russia itself made much worse for the Europeans, hope that they could break through and break the political center. And it's very, very concerning at this point.
Fiona, sort of persuasion at a time of Ukraine fatigue and complicated political patterns of left and right.
Yeah, these are all interrelated. In fact, all these three questions, one way or another, interrelated, because, what propaganda, Putin and many others is able to play upon is the grievances of people. And the grievances are all about costs of energy, hence the whole debate about what's the best way to provide energy. Do we go back to Russia again? Will it be cheaper? Will it be cheaper in one sense, but not in another over the longer term politically? The feasibility of doing, certain things, information and just what people know. And, exactly as Professor Schlögel has been laying out, most people don't really know much about most of these issues we're dealing with. People don't know much about energy and energy flows or, energy pricing and energy markets. They just speculate. You don't necessarily, you obviously know what you're talking about, but the average person has no real idea about the complexity of all of this. They don't know, for the most part, the history of Ukraine or, lots of other places for that matter. And we also know that there's a real persistence in political patterns over many generations, getting back to what Batu was talking about. And Putin and others have been able to take advantage of the fact that the political left in Europe, in the past, in Italy and in Germany, and Professor Schlögel already talked about his Maoist experience, back in the 1960s, or kind of in the Italian Communist Party, the French Communist Party. These were all generated by certain grievances about the way that society was functioning, and some of that expression of those same grievances are now on the right. The right is kind of picking up where the old left used to exist and operate. And all those ideas have come together. The FD, in fact, the MAGA movement here in the United States, are almost as leftist as they are, rightist. It's just a different expression. You saw that in Spain, of course, the Franco period, and now, Vox and the left in Spain often arguing about exactly the same thing. So the art of persuasion really kind of comes down to being able to talk to as many people as you possibly can. I mean, one of them is having this wonderful lecture, Professor Schlögel. I mean, there's a whole world of podcasts out there. I'm sure all of you are listening to very many, but it's incumbent on all of us, to get out there to talk to as many people as possible, but also to listen. And I think that was kind of the message that we got from Professor Schlögel. And I have the same, sadness, from his point of view, that I can't go to Russia. I can't go out and, I think the idea of hearing how a country ticks, it also talks, by the way, but it's also, kind of interesting to kind of like figure out what that rhythm is, what people are thinking, how that pendulum is moving backwards and forwards. It's pretty critical, and I think all of us need to have a little bit of myself very much so humility about we don't really understand all the dynamics, but the only way to do so is to engage as broadly and as persistently as we possibly can, and very grateful to have this kind of engagement, to have an opportunity to think differently.
Well, Professor Schlögel, we've gone from arguments in a Bavarian household to arguments on the international stage, and let's turn to you for the last word for today's conversation about perhaps persuasion, first and foremost, but persuasion at a time of political turmoil.
First of all, I agree totally what you said about in accepting the vulnerability of our societies and the possibilities of the Putin regime to intervene and to instrumentalize these internal clashes, differences. This is very important to recognize the fact and not to ignore. So I agree fully. Concerning persuasion, I have a very old-fashioned view on this. We have to insist that there's a difference between fake and fact. That there's a line, a red line or black line between reality and fiction, and we have to insist that we have to work with reality and to fight against the big lie. There is a culture of big lies and normalization of the lies. And in Germany, I also always recommend in TV, in the evening program, just to show one evening Moscow TV. To understand the sound of the discourse, the talk shows where they are discussing about nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons, where should they be placed? Is it better to shoot rockets to Poznan in Poland or to Berlin? The normalization of bizarre a discourse which in normal times we could not understand, but this discourse is going on. And we have to stand against this. And there's a very famous and good book by Peter Pomerantsev where he wrote on the title, "Everything is true, everything is false, everything is possible." So there is a line between truth and lie, and we have to defend that there is a difference. And so I'm convinced that truth will be stronger than the lie, even the most intelligent lie.
Well, Eric Charamella, Fiona Hill, and Professor Schlögel, thank you so much for joining for this panel.